has a deletion positive Angelman, and because of her, I went back to school and got my Master's of Education in Special Education and Assistive Technology for students with significant disabilities. And my big interest has just been how literacy develops in our kids with Angelman. All right, so let's get going. What you see on the screen here, there's a picture that I think really show. I'm trying not to read the little message on the side. Never see it every screen. Sorry about that. The picture you're going to see here just on the cover slide so far is a friend of Maggie's, and I just feel like this really symbolizes the progress and importance of Maggie's literacy instruction. We only really started figuring out literacy instruction for Maggie about 2 years ago, and after more than a year into it, Maggie was assigned a writing assignment. She was refusing to cooperate. Her teacher ended up kind of just going with the flow and saying, fine, if you won't write about what you're supposed to write about, then here, took a picture of her classmate who was distracting her and being silly and said, write about your friend Maisie. And that was the first time that in response to that, you can see what Maggie typed below, that she actually typed something decipherable. So it was just a huge milestone in her literacy development that we got to a point where she typed her first decipherable word, and she's now typed much more than that. So most students with Angelman syndrome are emerging as readers and writers, which means that what they understand about literacy, what they do with literacy materials, are the kinds of understandings that we expect from kids from the age of birth, from the moment of birth until they're in school age. And so as we understand how most of our kids are developing, that's the frame of reference, that's the literature that we look at. So it's the kinds of instruction, the kinds of learning that students have about literacy before they start getting literacy instruction in conventional literacy, which is what follows emergent literacy. The most important thing to know about emergent literacy is that it's directly related to opportunity and experience. And we know this. The research, hands down, David Koppenhaver's research, Karen Erickson's research, Diane Brower's research, hands down shows it comes down to opportunity and experience. But unfortunately, students with significant disabilities tend to have the fewest opportunities and experiences that lead to literacy. They probably have the greatest need for these opportunities and experiences, and yet they actually receive the fewest. And you'll see some more examples of what that is. But the kinds of experiences and opportunities are reading storybooks at home with your family, begging to have the same storybook read 400 times over the course of a year by a parent every night, watching your parents read and sitting down next to them and pretending to read as well, watching your parents write and realizing that writing is something powerful and having opportunities to write that other people give you feedback on. Those are all some of the opportunities and experiences that develop emergent literacy so that students are ready for conventional literacy instruction, and those are really the things we need to be thinking about for our kids with Angelman. What this is just a graph showing that literacy development is completely tied into the development of communication. So receptive communication, receptive understanding, when we understand what is said around us, it develops in tandem at the same time as our expressive communication, as our reading and writing. There used to be a sense that there was this developmental progression. First, kids learn how to understand what's said around them, then they learn how to start talking, then they learn how to start reading, and then they learn how to start writing. And there's this developmental progression, and so you need to first show how much you understand before you kind of get instruction to move you along. But now we know that they develop completely in tandem. And one reason that literacy instruction is so important for our students with Angelman is because in order for them to develop their expressive communication skills, we really need to be developing their reading and writing. There is fascinating research showing that for students who don't speak, who have to use an AAC system, some form of communication system, to communicate with others, That is cognitively the same process as writing. That is selecting a tool and using symbols to convey a message, to take a message that's in your head and express it to someone else. That is writing. So our kids need writing instruction because that's really how they're going to learn how to use their AAC systems. Reading is very much a process of learning how to take in the stories of other people, and writing is a way that we express our own stories back. So there was an interesting survey, I think about 8 years ago, where a researcher asked parents of students with Angelman syndrome what were their priorities for their child's education. And parents overwhelmingly wanted to focus on communication, and most parents thought that the kind of sight word instruction that was happening in their child's classroom was actually distracting them, was time that could have been spent on developing their communication skills. And what I'm hoping that this will show throughout this webinar is that there's no competition. When we are creating the opportunities for students to be engaged in emergent literacy experiences, we are developing their communication at the same time we're doing everything else. Chris Cleaver talks about the 5 currents of emergent literacy, and I just think this is worth putting out there because so many parents or teachers say, that's great that you talk about literacy for students with Angelman, but that doesn't yet apply to our kid. My kid is not there yet. They're too low functioning. They're not ready for literacy experiences. But this is really what emergent literacy is. It's being able to make sense of the stories of others, to be able to hear and relate to the stories of other people. It's being able to find the meaning in your own experience and share it with other people. It's being able to communicate your thoughts using some form of graphic symbols and being able to interpret the meaning of graphic symbols that are used by others. And I think most importantly, it's about deriving joy from engagement with printed language and graphic symbols, because it's really that joy and the joy in the interaction that creates the motivation for communication. So if we think about emergent literacy for our students with Angelman, I think within this framework, then we really understand what it's all about. I'm putting this out there. I know when I first started talking to Maggie School about a literacy plan for her, no one knew where to start. They didn't know how to look at her and have any idea of where we should start, and that ended up becoming my master's research was, okay, where do we start? And I think it was really important for them to know that I'm not, as a parent, I wasn't expecting them to teach Maggie how to read within a year or within 2 or 3 years, that I am perfectly fine with the idea that it might be a 50-year literacy plan. And they are only responsible for the first 12 years. But we have to figure out what start to finish a literacy plan looks like for Maggie, even if it is a 50-year plan, for them to know where to start, for them to know what those first 12 years need to look like. And what I told school was, wherever she's at when she's finished with school, we'll keep it going. That will be her post-secondary education. And I just came up with this number 50, going, 50 years from now, I'll say, okay, we've done enough and she can retire. But in the meantime, this is the plan, because I can't think of anything that will give her more power over her own life over time than becoming literate. And when we focus on what's important about emergent literacy development, the worst case scenario is that we're going to teach Maggie to love books and to derive joy from sharing her experiences with others. So there is no damage that can be done from this, from a focus on this. And just the other piece that's important for Maggie and for many of our kids is that she's included in a regular grade 5 classroom, but her inclusion, the inclusion of her was sort of falling apart. And I think it's because for several years they just didn't understand her as potentially literate. And if a student is in the class and we don't believe they can learn how to read and write, then we end up not really knowing why exactly they're in the classroom then in the first place, because learning to read and write is the essential work of school. So once we focused on literacy instruction, all the questions and concerns and challenges we had around Maggie's school inclusion actually became much simpler. They kind of answered themselves, because what we found was the general curriculum is what she's going to read and write about. So we were just able to, instead of thinking about what are her goals for social studies and then what are her goals for science and then what are her goals for each other topic, is to instead just say, let's just look across the school day and look at every subject as an opportunity for reading, writing, and communicating. And with just those three focuses, that's where we're going. And really, this is what we do with all students in kindergarten and grade 1, is we're teaching them how to read and write. And then after about 2nd grade, we are using reading and writing to learn. But before then, we're learning how to read and write. So we're just extending that phase that all the other students have in kindergarten and grade 1 all the way through high school career. And again, I'll just throw this out there. Inclusive classroom contexts and the general curriculum really provide the foundation for a balanced literacy approach, for the kind of comprehensive instruction that we know all students need. The research is quite clear, especially from the National Reading Panel and the National Early Literacy Panel, that students need comprehensive instruction, which means that literacy instruction needs to develop their oral language and their vocabulary, their phonemic awareness and their phonological awareness. They need to learn sight words, which is automatic word recognition, but they also need to be able to read with fluency, to read with comprehension, to be able to write, and to read independently for a variety of purposes. And we know that the general education curriculum is structured in a way to ensure that students are getting this instruction all across the school day. But what has happened for so long is that students with significant disabilities are typically not considered candidates for that kind of comprehensive instruction, the instruction that we know is necessary for students without disabilities to become conventional readers and writers. We do know, and there's been extensive research, you can see some citations below, that students who receive comprehensive literacy instruction make significant gains over students who are the same age, have the same level of abilities, and just receive the more traditional sight word instruction that has traditionally happened in special education classrooms. Okay, so it's just time to reimagine functional literacy. That I'm just throwing all this out there to kind of provide a context for all this. If we're focused on a student's functional skills and we just want to develop functional life skills, there is no more important functional life skill, in my opinion, than the ability to read and write well enough to conduct your daily affairs, to have independence, to be able to have autonomy and control over your own life. So the things that lead to stronger literacy skills are the same ones that develop communication skills, social interaction, and independence. All right, and fundamentally, this is a quote from Karen Erickson, that literacy and reading are not spinach. So if it feels like we are doing something with a child where we are trying to force them to eat spinach, where we're not enjoying it and they're not enjoying it, then we're really doing something wrong, and we need to step back and do something different. Because emergent literacy experiences, if we get back to what Chris Cleaver talks about, which is enjoying the stories of other people, finding meaning in your own stories and sharing them, deriving joy, then we know that that's not eating spinach. So if it feels like spinach, we're doing something wrong. We need to do something different. All right, so in this webinar, we're looking at what emergent literacy looks like for students with the learning characteristics we associate with Angelman syndrome, and we're asking how do we assess and measure this progress in their IEPs. Assessment. These are the tools. What you'll see here are tools to help us understand our students with Angelman syndrome as potentially literate. We're going to measure what our students currently understand about literacy. We'll use these tools to do that, and we'll use these tools to help us identify the next step in their instruction. And I think one of the most important things we do that I use these tools for is to help us identify the gaps in their instruction, in their opportunities, in their experiences, so we can make sure that they are receiving the same opportunities, the same experiences for authentic reasons to read and write and share their stories and hear the stories of others, so that these skills will develop. To me, the most useful tool, the most comprehensive tool for our kids, for us as educators, for us as parents, to measure what our kids know is called the bridge. And this is just a page of where the bridge was written up in the journal Young Exceptional Children. back in June 2009. So this, the bridge was developed by Patsy Pierce and several others. And what it did was take what we know about typically developing preschoolers and their emergent literacy understandings, adapted from, you'll see here, from the Troll, which was just a different tool, and now said, what happens when we apply this to students with disabilities? How can we take what we know about measuring literacy development in typical preschoolers and apply it to students with disabilities? And note that, you'll see that also here in the box, that all of these items include a child's use of assistive technology. So if a child is reading adapted books, if they're reading books on a computer, if they're using a communication system, that we include all of that as we're assessing them. The one reason I like the bridge so much is that there's just enormous supports for learning how to use it. I find it very straightforward. I find that parents and teachers can look at the questions and with very little assistance can get a snapshot, can develop a snapshot of what their student currently understands and what they need to do next. And the Center for Literacy and Disability Studies has just really extensive support. So there's a guide to administering it. The bridge is intended to be used for portfolio assessment. So you're developing evidence with your student over time. You're keeping records and remnants of the kinds of things that they're doing. When you see a student reading a book and using their finger to touch the text, you jot it down and add it to their portfolio because you now have another piece of evidence that they're understanding the significance of print, stuff like that. There is a detailed PowerPoint presentation you can see here as one of the bulleted points to train preschool teachers or to train any teacher on how to use the bridge, along with multiple examples of what different evidence basically looks like. And where it says a list of action verbs that can focus early literacy observations, it's just it's a way of prompting teachers and parents to be able to look at what it is the student is doing and be able to describe it. So anyway, really, really excellent supports. It's a completely free assessment tool. Anyone can download it from this website. If you just Google the bridge emergent literacy, you will find it, and lots of supports here to learn how to use it. Okay, so the first question that the bridge asks is looking at sort of foundational reading skills. So what does our student know about books? Or do they appreciate books? Are they aware of print on the page? Are they comprehending stories? And so the first question asks, how do they handle and interact with books? Do they explore them? Exploring books includes chewing on them. It includes turning the pages any direction, right to left, left to right, picking books up, dropping them, all of those things. Being aware of books gets you a score of number 1. You were exploring books. Browsing book pages means you're actually moving through the pages. You might be skipping pages in between. You might be going from the front to the back, but you're really browsing. Holding the book appropriately means you're learning that books have a top and a bottom, a backwards and forwards, and you're becoming aware of that. You're becoming aware that text reads from the left to the right and from top to bottom. And you'll see students developing more sophistication in how they hold books over time. And then we expect to see, so you'll see that as this assessment tool goes along, this is what we expect. This is the developmental progression we expect to see. But then we see students making independent study of book pages. With our kids with Angelman, you'll often see them putting their finger on the page to kind of direct their vision as they're going through the page. We now see them turning pages appropriately and really going page by page, front to back, and recognizing books by their cover. When we did a survey of mostly parents, this was just an informal survey, just using SurveyMonkey, trying to get kind of a baseline from our Angelman community. You'll see that 85% of our parents report that their their child, most of these kids were preschool or school age all the way up through secondary, that they explore books. So the vast majority of our students explore books. They hold them, they look at them, they chew them. About 2/3 of them rip the pages. So that's a really, really common barrier that we have to problem solve for our kids, because what we find is because they can be destructive with their books, we limit their access to them. And that means we're limiting their opportunities to develop their reading skills. So we need to figure out the kinds of sturdy books that they can't destroy. We need to figure out access to paper books that we don't mind if they get destroyed. We need to teach them how to take care of their books. We might need to make laminated books. We might need to put them on a computer. We know that half of our students, according to their parents, enjoy books and actively seek them out. They browse the pages because they're turning the pages, but they might be flipping back and forth. So 2/3 of them are browsing books. About 1/3 of them are holding the book right side up and have learned, it means that they've learned enough about print to know if the book is upside down or right side up. 42% are independently studying the book pages. 42% are also recognizing the book by their cover. And this is really interesting because, according to the Bridge, this is one of the most sophisticated steps in books, recognizing books by its cover. And yet I'm finding that our students with Angelman usually recognize books by their cover long before they've developed some of the other skills, probably because they're used to learning how something looks visually in order to request it. And so there's sort of a disproportionate number of our students who recognize books by their cover. And it's very likely that parents and teachers are taking pictures of the covers of books and teaching kids to really attend to that. And it's working. Our kids are recognizing that. The second question in the Bridge asks, how does the student interact with symbols and print? Do they communicate a choice of story, song, or rhyme by using a picture, symbol, or object? So that can be using any form of communication system, any form of picture. And for some of our kids with Angelman, it's more that you get that affirmation for them, that affirmation from them, that when you start to do something, maybe you get the nodding body or the bounce up and down that tells you, yes, I'm asking you to keep doing this, or I'm asking you to do this. It becomes more sophisticated as students begin to recognize print, to frequently recognize print, to start pointing to letters in their environment, pointing to words in their environment, pointing to the pictures or the print on the page rather than the pictures on the page. We know that students who use AAC systems, who aren't verbal, get so much reminders, so much emphasis put on pictures that they come to assume that the meaning on the page is from the pictures and not the print. And so they end up being delayed in their recognition of print and their use of print because all the rest of us are telling them, don't worry about the words, just look at the pictures. So this is one of the opportunities that we all need to be aware of, and one of the experiences that we need to be aware of is really drawing their attention to print so that they recognize it, pointing it out in their environments. Many of our kids maybe struggle with their visual attention, particularly their visual attention over space or across a room. And so there might be lots of print in the room, but we might need to bring that print to them a lot closer for them to see it. That many of our kids, I think, struggle to organize their vision to look at something like a word wall that's high on a wall on the other side of the room. We might need to bring that right to them to create that opportunity. When we asked our Angelman community what it is our students do with print, you'll notice that 94% of our students enjoy when we sing songs. So that's one of the ways that they are showing a preference or making a choice around songs. 41% are making signs or motions for songs we sing, and about 1/3 are requesting specific stories or songs. 2/3 of our students enjoy listening to songs, but then you'll notice that as we go down, as we start looking at the more sophisticated literacy kind of knowledge, we start to see a drop. So only about 20% of parents see their students showing that the words on the page of a book are significant. Only 15% see their students attending to the words and not just the pictures. Only 13% see our kids pointing to words on the page. Only 5% see the student pointing to words as the adult reads the words. So this is clearly an area of need, an area of instruction for our kids, is we need to figure out the instructional approaches. And there's many, which we'll cover in a subsequent webinar, about how we are going to teach them to attend to the words on a page. The other thing I would notice, I would point out, 15% of parents report that their child does not attend when we read stories. My child was certainly one of those. And 4% say their child does not attend when we sing songs. So that is, when we come across these things, when we look at this on the bridge and we say, my student doesn't even do number one, where do I start with that? That's really where we need to start our problem-solving process and say, okay, so why is the student not attending when we read stories? In Maggie's case, when I explained to the literacy expert Gretchen Hanser how Maggie reacts when we try to read to her, she actively turns her head away, she'll get up and leave the room. I would be trying to read to her and I'd be pointing to the pictures, I'd be pointing to the words, and she'd push it away or she'd look away. The entire time I couldn't get her to attend at all. She believed that that sounded like an auditory processing issue, and she described Maggie as possibly being deafblind in terms of struggling to coordinate her vision and her hearing together. No one had ever suggested that before. I had just always thought that the issue was that Maggie was so developmentally delayed that she just wasn't ready to attend to books yet. But babies are actually attending to books, start attending to books very, very young. So in Maggie's case, Gretchen was absolutely right. And we did more investigation with her vision. Maggie has a cortical vision impairment. She started getting support from a teacher for the blind. The teacher for the blind said Maggie can clearly not coordinate her vision and her hearing together at the same time. So when we would sit down to read with Maggie, we're asking her to listen to my voice while looking at the page and engaging in joint attention. That was just more than she could do. And we had to problem solve and find a new way for her to move forward. And what we found with Maggie has been one of the most powerful is computer books. So books that she can read on her iPad, books that she can read on the computer where she doesn't have to attend to another person at the same time. We also found that she becomes much more attentive when classmates and friends are reading to her rather than adults. So this is what I mean by using these assessment tools to problem solve what's going on. If the student is not attending when we read stories, and we need to figure out why. Maybe we need to read different stories. Maybe we need to change the sensory makeup of the stories that we're reading, do things like try digital stories and computer stories and iPad stories, and see what happens if we change what we're doing. Does that change how the student responds? Next question in the bridge asks how the student engages in the act of reading. Are they aware that someone is reading to them? Do they display joint attention while being read to? Do they point to things in the book? Do they label things in the book, comment on it? That sort of thing. Do students engage in parallel reading or solitary reading? These are really important, and something we're seeing in our students with Angelman is that they're very aware that someone's reading to them. Most of our students display joint attention while being read to, but so many of our students don't have a communication system, and so it all falls down at number 3, where it comes to labeling, commenting on, or acting out story characteristics. So if a student does not have a communication system, if they've gotten that far, if you as a teacher are saying, okay, my student is definitely aware they're a 1, nope, they're actually a 2 because they're displaying joint attention, but they're not commenting on or labeling books as we read them, then we now need to say, okay, what is it they need to be able to comment on the story as they read? Do they have a communication system? How can we get them one? If they have nothing else, can they have what's called an aided language display, just some kind of a symbol display with comments like boring, turn the page, let's read something else, exciting, fun, whatever words they need so that they can be part of that story reading experience. Because what you'll see in this question on the bridge is children begin to take over ownership of the reading process. And anyone who's ever read to a 2-year-old has seen this, where you start out reading to the child, but children naturally on their own take over control. They want to hold the book, they want to point to the words, they want to memorize the book and try to read it back to you. And that is the normal developmental progression. So we have to figure out how to support that progression in our students with Angelman. Reading to another, number 5 in this, in the development of how students engage in reading, is really essential. When a typical kid has heard a book so many times that they've memorized it, and they can turn the pages, and now they can pretend to read the book to their stuffed animals, or they can pretend to read it to their baby sister, or pretend to read it to you. What has developed there is the student now believes that they are a reader. They believe that they're capable of reading, and that is an incredibly important understanding for every student to develop. So we have to figure out how to support our kids with Angelman to get to that point, which means that they need a lot of repetition of reading their favorite books so that they can start having that sense of having memorized. And then we have to figure out how we're going to support them to read to another person, and chances are it's going to take lots of assistive technology or communication system for them to be able to engage in that. But we'll get more into that in a subsequent seminar. Okay, when we asked our families, how does our student engage in reading, you'll see that 3/4 the student is clearly aware someone is reading to them. 2/3 say their student enjoys being read to, but 1/4 say my student does not attend when I read stories. So when we get to that, when we mark that and say that, then we know that we've got some problem solving to do there. We need to read different books. We need to try reading to books reading books in a different way. So you'll notice that the next question asked, well, what happens if you offer an electronic story, a story on a computer or an iPad? And now 42% say that the student reads that. It'd be interesting to see how many students who don't attend when an adult reads stories will actually listen to it if it's in video form or on a computer or an iPad. So, next, the bridge asks, how does the student draw or write? Here's just some examples down below of how we see our kids writing. Exploration of drawing and writing tools. We're looking at this now as a motor skill. Involves being able to pick up a pencil and make a mark, chewing on a crayon. Whatever it is that they're doing, are they exploring writing utensils? If they are, they get a 1. Are they beginning to show purpose in how they're drawing and writing? Are they really taking that crayon and putting it down on paper to make some kind of mark? That's showing us beginning purpose. And then we expect to see more obvious purpose developing. We begin to see that their writing starts looking different from their drawing, and you can see the illustration down here on the right. This is the student with Angelman, and you can see her writing is very clearly distinct from her drawing. So she's telling a story on this paper. We don't necessarily know what she's telling a story about unless she's got a communication system where she can explain to us what she was imagining. But you can see that her writing is clearly writing-like and looks different from her drawings. And as the student's starting to use disconnected scribble with some letter-like forms, some recognizable letters, and we'll get more into the writing. What is holding most of our students with Angelman back on the writing is both opportunity and the sensory issues. So many of our kids really resist. They have such sensitive palms of their hands that they just really resist holding things and grasping things. And that's where we need to figure out, well, we just have to problem solve. Okay, if my student is really not even exploring or not exploring enough to really show purpose, then we need to support them to draw and write using different tools. We call those alternative pencils. And we'll get into that. These are 2 examples. The example on the left is a piece of writing from the typical sibling of a student with Angelman syndrome. So I think she's 4 or 5 years old, and this is what writing looks like when you're a 3 or 4-year-old with strong emergent literacy skills. If you know the little girl, then you can see her name in there. You can see mom, and you can see really important letters to her. When her mom asked her what she had written about, it was, I believe that this one was something about a story about a princess and a dragon. And you can see letter P and letter D. So what this little girl is doing is she knows certain letters She's letting one letter stand for an entire word, so where she might have the letter P. She might be thinking princess. The only letter she might know that relates to princess is the letter P, so she's going to fill it in. And that is what typical writing looks like. On the right-hand side, you'll see a writing sample from a student with Angelman syndrome who was using what's called an alternative pencil. So she had an alphabet flip chart. She was selecting letters, and she had already selected pictures to show what it was she was writing about. And then what's so key here is that she was able to use her communication system to clarify her writing. So we see a lot of G's, where she was writing the word game. We see a really clear word watch starting to appear, and we see the two important vowel sounds for the word Anna or Anna. So I'm just putting these two together to show how this is a student with Angelman who is developmentally in her writing very similar to a typical child with emerging literacy skills. When we asked our families about how their child writes, 1/3 says their child does not write or draw at all. 60% said they explore crayons and writing tools by maybe some marking, touching them, chewing them. 60% say their child makes some marks with writing and drawing tools, but only 20% felt that their child was writing or drawing with purpose. Only 14% said that their writing is looking different from their drawing. And you can see that the numbers drop considerably about whether the writing looks like words or letters. When we see this with students with significant disabilities, we need to look at that as understanding that this is a motor issue. So holding a pen, holding a crayon, holding a marker, and being able to write a letter is about motor control. And that is separate from cognitively understanding the letter and being able to convey it. So we need to separate that and figure out what we call an alternative pencil. There we go. So we then asked about, well, what about if a student is using a keyboard? Will they use a keyboard? Because a keyboard is an alternative pencil. It's a way to write all of the letters in the alphabet without actually having to hold a pen, hold a marker, and have that same level of motor control. 52% said their student does not type on keyboards at all. About half of our kids type random characters. They don't appear to know the difference between letters, numbers, and all the other characters on the screen, whereas about 1/4 of our kids are typing long strings of letters. So it may appear random, but they know the difference. If a student has a whole keyboard and they're typing long strings of letters, that tells us that they know the difference between letters, numbers, and the other characters on the screen, which is just very important. And then we want to see their writing develop into shorter strings of letters that actually look like the English language, because when you see a long string of letters, I think I might have a sample. No, I don't. When you have a long string sample, a long string of letters that doesn't look like the English language, we know that kids are developing in their literacy understandings when we see 3 or 4 letters, space, 1 letter, space, 2 letters, space. They know what words look like, and they're trying to type something that looks like words. So this is clearly, writing is a key piece of the problem solving and the instruction we need to be working on with our kids. We asked, so we wanted to know how much of this, if students aren't writing with the alphabet, then how many opportunities are they getting? If they're not using a keyboard, how many opportunities are they getting to learn how to use one? And only 8% of our students are getting access to write with the alphabet, either on their communication system, on a computer keyboard, in their pod book. Only 8% of our students are getting that opportunity multiple times per day. And you'll see here that 64% of our students never have the opportunity to write using the letters of the alphabet in any way. 10% are only getting occasional opportunities. So when we take us back to what we know about emergent literacy development, 3/4 of our students are not writing with the alphabet, and they're not getting the opportunity to write with the alphabet. And by writing with the alphabet, I mean writing with the letters of the alphabet, having access to the full alphabet to be able to combine and recombine letters and put them in different order and actually see what it is to write with letters versus cutting and pasting words versus working with words that someone else has selected and put it in a word bank, that we know that it's absolutely essential for learning how to write to have access to the full alphabet. And 75% of our students with Angelman have no access to it. The bridge asks, how does the student use print? Do they use any symbols to communicate? Do they use any drawings to communicate meaning? Do they understand? What these questions are really starting to get at is, do they understand that writing is important and it has a purpose? So are they using scribbles to pretend to write letters and create messages and make a list? We might not be able to read it, but what we're getting at is that developmental stage that all little kids go through, where they start writing notes to people. Or they're mad at mommy, so they write a note telling her that they're mad and you can't actually read it. Or they write a reminder on a sticky note to make sure you buy cookies from the grocery store and you can't read it, but the child understands. When they do that, they understand that writing is important and it makes things happen. It tells a story. It shares an experience, and that's just a really essential understanding to now develop the skills to learn conventional reading and writing. The examples you'll see down below here on both the far left and the far right are writing samples from students with Angelman. The one in the middle is a typical sibling. So you'll see that she's at a stage of understanding that writing and drawing are different, and yet you can still see a lot of overlap. You see some letters interspersed with her drawing. You're not quite sure if parts of her drawing might actually be letters. And so it's kind of drawing to write or writing to draw, where there's a developmental stage where this mixes together. For our students with Angelman, if they aren't able to hold a pencil, then they may not have very many opportunities to even develop these understandings. And so we have to scaffold that. And in a subsequent webinar, we'll talk about one of the easiest ways to do that is to help our kids by giving them photos along with the alphabet in a variety of different structures, so that we can try to help construct enough understanding of what topic they're writing about for them to now add the print to it. This is just another example of drawing from a student with Angelman. So clearly some of our kids are really figuring this out, but it comes down to opportunity, especially if the student doesn't have the motor control to hold a pen. When we asked our families and teachers both filled out the survey, 2/3 of our kids are not currently using print or symbols at any time. So clearly this is an enormous area of need, is making sure that all of our students have access to a really comprehensive symbolic communication system so that they can start having much more access to both print and symbols. The bridge asks, how does the student write his or her name? This is both a motor and a cognitive item. So it's a motor question in terms of, can the child pick up a pen and start trying to scribble, start trying to write? But it's also a cognitive item of understanding that I'm supposed to label my things. I'm supposed to label my schoolwork. I'm supposed to sign my name in. I'm supposed to sign my name out. That I'm capable of writing my name. And so that's one of the things we're looking at here. What we expect to see, what we would expect to see in a typically developing student, is that they would, a 1 or 2-year-old would start making some kind of inconsistent mark or scribble. They understand the concept of writing their name, but the way they scribble it every time looks different. And then we start seeing it become much more consistent looking. So we might not be able to read it, but they have a consistent scribble to write their name. And then over time we start to see they understand what letters look like, and they're able to shape their scribble to look more like letters. We start to see the actual letters of their name starting to appear when they do try to write their name. Then we start seeing some kind of recognizable form, and then eventually they're able to write their full name and their last name. What you'll see down here on the right as a picture is that many of our students, the only writing that they're having the opportunity to do is actually tracing. Tracing focuses on the motor aspect of writing your name, but it actually doesn't focus on the cognitive aspect at all. And so what we're doing is we would expect that the motor part of writing your name is actually the most difficult. So we're having a student write her name focusing on the motor aspect, but we may not be capturing what she cognitively understands. We know that fine motor skills tend to be more underdeveloped or more impacted by Angelman syndrome than any other skill set next to communication. So when we look to what a student can write or trace with a marker or with a pen to see if that's what they understand, chances are we're going to underestimate them. And we may need to find a way to give them, again, an alternative pencil. What happens if they have the keyboard? Can they type their name if they can't actually write it or trace it? What you'll see down on the left on the screen is a signage sheet, which is what this mother did, which is just brilliant, is create a system where her children were expected to sign in and out before they could do different favorite activities to make sure that her daughter had those opportunities all across the day to try to generate her own name. And you can see that after only a few times trying to write, it's very possible that her daughter is understanding that the letter S is a big squiggle because she's understanding she's supposed to sign, and she's understanding that there's a big squiggle in the first letter of her name, and she's going to try to do it. What her mother did after she wrote was then write her name afterwards. So, wow, Sarah, you wrote your name. That's how you write it. I'm going to show you how I write it. What that does is that separates the cognitive aspect. So when Sarah went to write her name, she really had to be able to visualize in her mind what her name looked like and try to write that without copying. Copying is a very different skill. What her mother did was reinforce what she was doing by writing it after the fact. So we just want to avoid tracing and copying if we're really trying to understand what the student cognitively understands. All right, when we asked our families, 2/3 of our kids do not make any mark or scribble to represent their name. Only about 15% make an inconsistent mark or scribble. Only about 4% make a consistent mark or scribble. But when you actually talk to families, most of our kids aren't being asked to write their names. So you look at the typical kids the same age at their preschool, at their school, they have to write their name on things constantly, on every single assignment, every single exam, to sign out a library book, to sign in the computer lab. Our students usually aren't even being asked to do that, so they're not even getting the opportunity to start trying to make a mark or scribble to represent their name. So if this is where we're at, that the student doesn't currently make any mark or scribble, then what we have to do is really structure those opportunities. Some of our students, you'll see about 15% are using a name stamp with a prompt, but we don't know. Using name stamps are fine for certain things, but we don't actually know that we have the student's cognitive engagement when we do that. For all we know, the student knows that every time they're handed a stamp, they're supposed to use it, but we don't know that they're actually cognitively engaged in writing their name. If there's one thing that every person should be able to write with a pen or pencil if they possibly can, it's their name. So we just need to create those opportunities to make sure our kids can learn this. The bridge asks, how do students interact with and use letters of the alphabet? Are they exploring and playing with alphabet materials? Are they learning that letters are different from pictures, numbers, other shapes? Are they starting to recognize their name when they see it in the environment? Are they starting to recognize individual letters in their name? And are they able to identify at least 10 letters, sort of the most sophisticated step here in terms of emergent literacy development. It's interesting to me when I see IEPs for our kids, because so many of our IEPs focus on that very last step of identifying letters and the students recognizing their own name. But you'll see that those are actually fairly sophisticated understandings compared to really exploring and playing with alphabet materials, and compared to everything we saw earlier about writing, having the opportunity to write with the alphabet. So it may be what we'll often see when we complete a bridge assessment on a student is that they recognize their name. Many of our students recognize some of the letters in their names, and they can often identify letters. But they actually have very little interaction with print, and don't do anything when presented with the alphabet. So they're learning things out of context or decontextualized. They're learning how to memorize what their name looks like, but they're not actually getting to explore the alphabet in a way that's going to develop emergent literacy understandings. The image that's down here on the right is a text message sent by a student with Angelman. So this is what she does when she sees the alphabet. She knows that she's supposed to write. She doesn't yet know what words look like. So what she's writing does not look like the English language. It doesn't look like the words that she would see around her yet, but she knows when she sees the alphabet she's supposed to be generating something with it. So that is a student who's got some developing awareness. We also don't see any numbers showing up on this, so we don't know what kind of keyword. This is a text message. She may have only had letters to choose from, but it's just interesting to look at that and know that we don't see any numbers. We do see some other characters, which probably, if this is a text message, is probably just if she held down a letter on the keyboard on a phone that it gave her some symbols for other ways of writing things like the letter E. All right, students with Angelman, 44% of parents report that their child does explore or play with alphabet materials and or toys. 20% know that letters are different from pictures or shapes. 30% know that their child recognizes the first letter in their name, and 21% recognize other letters in their name. Interestingly, 40% of our kids do not play with or engage with letters of the alphabet. So if they don't, again, that's an area where we need to do some problem solving. What would get them engaged with letters of the alphabet? And we'll cover that in a subsequent webinar, but it might be that we haven't found the materials or books or items, the different alphabet materials that would really engage that student's interest, and so that's probably where we need to start. The bridge asks, how does the student demonstrate phonological awareness? Phonological awareness is being able to hear the sounds of language and be able to manipulate the sounds of language. And not surprisingly, our students with Angelman syndrome, just like most students who don't use oral language, have very low scores or demonstrate very little phonological awareness. But so the first steps of phonological awareness are being able to participate in things like familiar sound and word play, such as following the beat in music, such as being able to clap out a beat, being able to see the rhythm in rhyming words in poems, that kind of thing. So if our students aren't yet showing this awareness, then we know that we really need to be creating opportunities for them to do this. Phonological awareness is directly related to future literacy skills. So if our students aren't developing phonological awareness, it's really going to hold them back in later being able to learn to read and write. The sixth step on this asks, can the student identify some letter sounds or make some letter sound matches? So notice that that is the most sophisticated step. So often I see our kids receiving instruction on this letter makes this sound before we've looked at the earlier building blocks of phonological awareness. So if our instruction is focusing on letter names and letter sounds, but our student isn't yet showing phonological awareness in terms of responding to rhyme, following a beat, identifying sounds and trying to name sounds in their environment, that sort of thing, then we might be trying to provide instruction that they're not ready for, and we might need to go back to a lot of more rhythmic patterning stuff to develop that before we try to teach them that. The bridge asks, can the student complete a familiar rhyme when reading brown bear, what do you see? Are they starting to predict what's coming up? Are they recognizing those rhymes? Are they starting to play with the sounds of language? So again, these are skills that most of our students with Angelman are barely interacting with. And one of the major areas for us as their parents and educators is figuring out how to problem solve this to make sure that they're getting the opportunities to develop these skills. When we asked our families, you can see 94% of our families say that their student enjoys music. 40% say the child participates in familiar sound and word play or can imitate actions during songs. 47% say their child follows a rhythmic beat. 16% think they can identify or name sounds in the environment, and then you see quite a drop-off in terms of can they repeat a rhythmic pattern, do they have awareness that different words begin with the same sound, do they know all the sounds of the letters of the alphabet. So we just need to make sure that we are figuring out where our student is at and developing the skills where they're at before we try to skip ahead things like teaching letter sounds. The bridge asks, how does the student interact during literacy-related activities? Are they vocalizing? Are they looking at and pointing to pictures and symbols? Are they starting to label them? And again, this really comes down to having a comprehensive communication system like the pod books you see in these pictures here, of having a tool to even be able to do that. And the most sophisticated would be being able to, most sophisticated skill on this continuum would be being able to retell a simple story with an activity sequence. I've seen many of our kids in their classrooms being asked to retell a simple story by resequencing it using pictures before they've developed the skills of looking at and pointing to pictures, before they've been provided with tools to be able to label pictures and actions, before they've been commenting on stories, before they've had the opportunity to have a tool to let them ask questions about the story. So sometimes our instruction is skipping ahead to what's actually the most sophisticated skill along this continuum before we have developed the students' oral language abilities or just their language abilities around the book before we get to that point. So I think this is a really important one for us to be aware of, figure out where our student is at. If they're at a level 2 right now where they're looking at and pointing to pictures and symbols in a book, then we need to make sure they have the tools to now start labeling them and commenting on them before we try getting them to sequence things. About 40% of our kids are vocalizing during literacy activities. 80% are looking at the pictures and symbols in books. About half of them are pointing to pictures and symbols in books. About a third are looking at or pointing to props during storytelling, such as if there's a doll with the story, but only less than 10% are labeling pictures and stories. Less than 7% are commenting on stories. So if this tells us something, I think one of the most important things it tells us is our students need a communication system that lets them interact using language during literacy opportunities so that they can be asking questions about the story, commenting on the story, and not just being asked to sort of being tested on their comprehension afterwards by whether they can sequence photos of it. The bridge asks, how does the student engage in storytelling? And again, this is just a huge area of need for our kids. Are our kids able to, it's asking, can our kids imitate the actions and sound effects and words from stories? Are they spontaneously starting to use things that are from their familiar stories? Using storybook language that they've read in their own stories. The ability to tell a story is a huge part of what we saw about those 5 currents of emergent literacy. Understanding you have a story to tell and being able to share it with someone else. But very few of our kids, the vast majority of them, do not appear to engage in storytelling at all. So this just really gets at a need for tools to support them as they do that. So we want to use those bridge results to describe the student's baseline. You know, we can go back, for example, and use this language to say, Maggie currently is imitating actions and sound effects and words from stories, but we haven't seen her spontaneously use any action sounds or words from familiar stories. So that's what we're going to work on next. We're going to really start emphasizing that and making sure that she has access to those words. We're going to really scaffold some opportunities for her to start doing that. We can use the bridge to track our students' progress over time, and I think one of the most important things we can do is really look for gaps and inconsistencies in their skills and understanding. If we say, if our answer to any of the questions on the bridge is not applicable, then we're doing something wrong. We need to problem solve there and figure out how our student can access the learning that is part of that area, and we can really use the bridge as a guide to make sure that we're fostering the opportunities our students need. I know I'm over time. I'm just going to quickly show a few other assessment tools. You'll see the URL for this literacy rubric is down at the bottom. The state of Louisiana has just some amazing emergent literacy materials. This is Kathy Staugler's literacy rubric. What's really nice about it, it's very quick to complete. It's not, you'll see it's not nearly as detailed as the bridge. It doesn't capture some of the areas of need that I think the bridge captures, but what you'll see very visually when you complete it is often our kids show very low phonemic awareness, but high levels of concept of print, higher levels of word recognition, especially if they've had sight word instruction, but very low levels of fluency, and yet they seem to have higher levels of comprehension. And what this does is it lets us use this tool over time. Maybe we complete it in the fall, complete it in the winter, and then complete it in the spring, and be able to use that measure to tell us how our student is learning, and it really points out areas of weakness. The developmental writing scale is absolutely brilliant. You'll see that it is presumed that the student may not be able to hold a marker or a pencil, and so, for example, here's what we see in typical beginning writers. On the left, level 1 is drawing, where the student might be making lines and curves that may appear to represent objects. For our student who cannot hold a traditional pencil or marker, it's selecting a picture would be the equivalent, the cognitive equivalent of that. Scribbling. A typical student might make continuous vertical, circular, or wavy lines across the page. You know, the way that little kids just kind of try to make it look like there's lines across the page. For a child who cannot hold a marker, we would kind of skip over that, but we would start giving them access to a keyboard or some other form of alphabet display for them to just generate as many strings of letters as they can, the way that you'll see in stage 3, stage 4. So a student is becoming more aware of writing if they're just typing long strings of letters, and then they're becoming more aware when they start putting them into what looks like words, and you can see some good examples here of word-like groupings. And then once they start getting to a point of we're starting to see intelligible words, that would be a level 5 on the developmental writing scale. So the example I showed you on the first slide of this presentation was Maggie's first intelligible word. We're almost done. This is an example of writing from a typical student, a typical sibling, but I just wanted to point it out because you can see, for example, I pet the horse is the first sentence. The student is using several places in this. He's using 1 or 2 letters to stand in for an entire word. This is a typical developmental stage. This is why it's so important that our kids get access to the complete alphabet to practice writing. They need to be able to go through that same stage. They need to be able to go through the same writing stage that you see in this sibling here on the left, where she wrote, where single letters are standing in for entire words, where she's putting every letter that's familiar to her, the few words that are familiar to her, and she's trying to convey a story. It's not decipherable to us yet, but she has the opportunity to do this because she's surrounded by markers, she's surrounded by people writing, she's surrounded by examples of why it's important to write, and she has access to try to do that. And our students with Angelman need the same opportunities. And lastly, I just want to draw your attention to the pragmatics profile. This is a gorgeous, I'm not sure that it's fair to call it an assessment tool, but it is such a useful tool for describing what a student can currently communicate and how they currently communicate it. It's so easy to sort of accidentally focus on things that feel more measurable to us, where we focus on trying to support the student to to request using pictures and symbols, when it turns out the student, if we actually complete the pragmatics profile, they might actually be quite good at requesting. They might not be using symbols to do it, but they're quite good at requesting, but they don't actually have a way to tell a story. And we know that being able to engage in storytelling is really essential for literacy development. So the pragmatics profile is just a really, really useful tool, and there's the web address for where you can download it. When it comes down to it, assessment is when we know the correct answer and we're waiting for the student to tell us the correct answer. That's fine. That is what conventional literacy assessment is all about. But it's very difficult to understand a student's emergent communication and emergent literacy if we are only asking them questions where we know the correct answer and we're waiting for them to offer us the correct answer. Because as you'll see through all of this, the correct answer is usually something that only the student knows. Only the student might know the comment they want to make about a book. Only the student might know the story that they want to tell. So we have to figure that out. Once they're at the point of conventional, once they've mastered these emergent skills and they're at the point of conventional literacy instruction, then it's easier to ask them these kinds of testing questions, these kind of assessment questions where we know the correct answer. But at this emergent level, that's just not developmentally most likely the most appropriate thing to do. All right, just throwing a few other resources out and then I'll be done. The Center for Literacy and Disability Studies at the University of North Carolina has phenomenal resources, and one of the most helpful is this document where they've written sample emergent literacy goals, and every single one of our kids, you can look at those sample goals and see goals that absolutely apply to them. So it's just a way of getting some support to write IEP goals that reflect what they currently understand and that will really move them along that developmental continuum. We have a Facebook group, the Angelman Literacy and Education Group. You are very welcome to join it. There's constant conversations all over that group. There's over 1,000 parents and teachers who are all trying to apply this information, so you're very welcome to join us there. David Copenhaver and Karen Erickson have a fantastic book called Children with Disabilities, Reading and Writing the 4 Blocks Way. You can get it as an ebook from Carson DeLosa Publishing, and it just shows you how to take that kind of comprehensive 4 blocks balanced literacy instruction that we do in gen ed classrooms and make it accessible to all of our kids. Caroline Musselwhite is a speech-language pathologist who is a literacy expert who's worked now with a number of students with Angelman, and her website is here at aacintervention.com, and probably one of the most useful things on her website is where it says Tip of the Month, and she'll write up kind of a one-page, quick and dirty something any teacher can just download and try at a time right there at the moment, really hands-on specific supports. Gretchen Hanser, these resources are kind of buried on the Center for Literacy and Disability Studies website, but the materials under the deafblind model classroom resources are absolutely appropriate for all of our students with Angelman. Everything from how to do writing with them, how to write IEP goals, how to help them have use and write remnant books so that they can engage in storytelling, and how to assess ourselves. You'll see down at the bottom, that last arrow. Emergent literacy interaction inventory is really kind of a self-assessment tool to be able to see if we are providing the opportunities that our students will learn from. And last, Karen Erickson is leading the Dynamic Learning Maps Consortium. I don't have the list of states here that are part of it, but if you look under more information, and then the drop-down menu has professional development, you'll see all these professional development modules and self-directed professional development modules teaching teachers how to implement all this information. Okay, so I know we are over time, but that's it.
No problem, Erin. Thank you so much. So I do have a couple questions. One of the main ones was if people could get a copy of your presentation.
Oh, sure.
If I'm allowed to do that, I can send it out to everybody later today.
Yeah, go ahead. You can send it out to everybody, and I can upload it to that Facebook group.
Oh, perfect. Okay. And then here's some of the questions. One of them is, can skills within the bridge be scattered within one question? Example, their child looks at books upside down, but they turn the pages appropriately, or would the child remain a 3 given that the upside down book is the majority of the time?
No, absolutely. So the way the bridge is written is it assumes that once you have 3 examples that a student can do something, you kind of mark it off. You still keep working on it because the child's probably going to be inconsistent, but we assume that the student has sort of learned that step. So if you've got at least 3 examples of them at a number 3, now you look ahead to number 4. It's very common for our kids to be scattered across the bridge, so that's a really good question. And what that usually reflects is, again, their opportunities, their experience, and their instruction. So they might have become very good at recognizing books by their cover. They might have become very good at turning pages, but there might be something else going on. It might be part of their visual processing that for whatever reason they might actually prefer looking at books upside down. It might be because of their vision issues or maybe they have fine motor issues where it's really difficult to turn a page, but they actually understand top to bottom. And so they're not turning pages the way you would expect, but they understand top to bottom, they understand left to right, and they recognize their books by their cover. So when you see that kind of inconsistency and scattering across, to me, that's where we have to problem solve and ask, okay, why are we seeing this? Is there something about the books? Is there something about their vision or their fine motor that might be holding them back? Is there something about their vision that we need to accommodate? What happens if we provide the student books in another format, such as on their iPad? Does anything change there if we take away, for example, the fine motor demands of being able to turn a page, and we just make it so all they have to do is swipe the page? What happens now? And so I would just try to offer books in different formats and see if that makes any difference. But some of our kids, I think, actually intentionally look at things upside down. And I would, if you see that happening consistently, I would ask for a vision teacher to assess their functional vision.
Okay. Another question we have is, would you suggest using the bridge with students with significant disabilities in addition to Angelman syndrome?
Absolutely. Yeah, it was not developed for Angelman syndrome. It was developed for the broader population of students with significant disabilities.
Okay. And then what are some techniques to use when assessing a child's understanding of rhyming?
Oh, that's a good one. That's complicated. I think that's going to have to be in a subsequent webinar where we actually look at the strategies for where to go next. So, because that would be such a long answer, and I want to show you some things. Sorry. Ask that in our Facebook Angelman education group, though, because I'm famous for my really long responses there.
All right.
And on the website.
And then one other question, and then we'll get going. And also, just to let everybody know, this session has been recorded, and we will post it to YouTube. So if you have to jump off now, you can go back and listen to it, or you can share the YouTube link with other people as well. So one last question. On the slide dated 11/23/13, the child's response to picture, how does one know what to record and how to leave spaces between words? Example, what does child, adult do?
Okay. Again, that might be more for a subsequent webinar because that's a bit of a long one and I'd want to actually show you things. I believe that what that child was doing was using something called an alphabet flip chart where the adult was showing her chunks of letters at a time. For example, A, B, C, and D. Is one of these your letter? Yes or no? And then moving on to E, F, G, H. Is one of these your letter? A lot of those kinds of ways of presenting the alphabet to the child will actually have a space or a symbol for insert a space. So if there is space to do that, if there's a symbol on the display, and there's multiple ways that we can provide kids with the alphabet. So it really depends on the tool. But a lot of the kind of so you might use an alpha board where it's all the letters of the alphabet and it has a few symbols like insert a page, capital, so capitalize that letter, that kind of stuff. They might use a keyboard, in which case they've got a space bar right there. So it really depends on the tool that you're using. But it's us asking the child a question, do you want a space there? Or finding a keyboard for them to use where they can select the space on their own. And then I believe what the student did after she had selected all of her letters was that her mom went back and using the student's communication system said, okay, can you tell me what you wrote? And that's where they figured out which chunks of letters represented which words. Sorry. I will have slides to explain that better the next time.
All right, great. So thank you, Erin. We appreciate you taking the time to do this, and we look forward to your follow-up webinars that we're going to be holding with you. Again, we'll be posting this to YouTube in the next couple of days, and we wanted to thank everybody for attending. Have a good day.
Thanks.